It is just after 10 o'clock at night in the Strait of Hormuz, and a warship is moving into position along one of the most contested waterways on Earth. 20% of the world's oil passes through this narrow channel every single day. Tonight, American crews. Missiles are in the air, Iranian drones are being intercepted over Kuwait. And in Washington, a president who once campaigned as the man who would keep America out of foreign wars is now warning that he is prepared to, in his words, finish the job. How did the United States arrive here again? And more urgently, where does this go next? To understand the moment we are in, we have to go back further than the headlines suggest. This is not a new war. It is the reignition of one. In late February of 2026, American and Israeli aircraft struck Iranian nuclear and military facilities in a campaign that Pentagon would later call Operation Epic Fury. The strikes were the culmination of years of failed diplomacy, broken nuclear deals, and a regional chess match that had been building since the collapse of the original Iran nuclear agreement almost a decade earlier. Within days, Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the man who had ruled the Islamic Republic since 1989, was dead, killed in the opening hours of the conflict along with members of his family. His son, Mojtaba Khamenei, would go on to inherit both his father's title and his fury. What followed was 5 brutal weeks of open warfare. Iranian ballistic missiles rained down on Israeli cities, American bases across Iraq, and the Gulf came under repeated drone and rocket fire from Iran-aligned militias. A U.S. Air Force refueling aircraft went down during the fighting, killing 6 American service members. The human toll inside Iran, according to figures the Trump administration would later cite, ran into the tens of thousands. By early April, both sides were exhausted enough to accept a ceasefire, brokered in large part by Gulf mediators anxious to keep the region's oil arteries open. But a ceasefire is not peace, it is a pause, and what came next would prove just how fragile that pause really was. For weeks, the world watched a strange, uneasy standoff play out across the Strait of Hormuz, as Washington and Tehran circled each other in a test of nerves over who controlled the flow of oil through one of the most vital choke points on the planet. Then, in mid-June, came a moment that seemed almost too dramatic to be real. Pakistan's prime minister, acting as an unlikely but pivotal mediator, announced that the United States and Iran had finalized a memorandum of understanding to end the war. Days later, President Masoud Pezeshkian signed his half of it in Tehran. Sanctions relief, a reconstruction plan for Iran, a 60-day window to negotiate the one issue that had never actually been resolved, Iran's nuclear program. For a brief moment, it looked like the deadliest Middle East conflict in a generation might actually be closing. It did not hold. And to understand why, you have to understand something that has defined this presidency from the very beginning, the razor-thin line between diplomacy as a genuine off-ramp and diplomacy as a stage for pressure. Within weeks, disagreements over Lebanon, over the pace of Iranian compliance, over accusations that Tehran was quietly rebuilding what had just been destroyed, began to fracture the fragile truce. Then, on July 8th, everything broke open again. Iran, according to U.S. and allied accounts, struck multiple commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The Pentagon responded within hours, striking Iranian territory. Iran responded to that by hitting American positions across the Gulf states. In the span of a single news cycle, the interim ceasefire that had taken months to build simply collapsed. This is the moment the current crisis truly begins, and it is worth sitting with because everything that follows flows from this single, violent turn. Since that day, the United States has carried out repeated rounds of strikes against Iranian military infrastructure, missile sites, drone facilities, and coastal defenses near the Strait of Hormuz. The Navy has reimposed a blockade of Iranian ports, choking off the regime's ability to export oil, its single most valuable lifeline. Iran, in turn, has struck back not just militarily, but rhetorically, warning that it would move to completely close the strait and target energy and water infrastructure across the region, the very infrastructure that millions of ordinary civilians on all sides depend on to survive. And into this volatile moment stepped an image that will likely define this chapter of the conflict in the history books. On a Friday, locked and loaded and aimed at Iran, with thousands more ready to follow, should Tehran act on what American and Israeli intelligence describe as an active, specific plot to assassinate the sitting president of the United States. It is worth pausing on that claim because it is serious and it is contested. Israeli intelligence reportedly warned Washington of a detailed assassination plan. Iran has not confirmed such a plot, and independent verification remains difficult given the fog of an active war. What is confirmed is that the threat exists in the minds of American officials seriously enough to trigger a presidential statement threatening the wholesale devastation of a nation of 91 million people. Whether that threat reflects genuine imminent danger, a negotiating tactic, or some combination of both, is precisely the kind of question historians will spend years untangling. For now, all we have is the fact that it was said, and the fact that Tehran heard it. To understand why a threat like this lands so hard, you need to understand the person making it and the political instincts that built his career. Donald Trump has never governed as a conventional hawk or a conventional dove. He has governed throughout his time in office as a negotiator who believes maximum pressure and maximum unpredictability are themselves tools of diplomacy. It is the same instinct that shaped his first-term approach to North Korea, to trade with China, to NATO burden sharing. Escalate loudly, then offer the door to a deal. Supporters call it leverage. Critics call it brinkmanship dressed up as strategy. Both descriptions are, in some sense, true at the same time, and both are visible in how this Iran conflict has unfolded. A war punctuated again and again by ceasefires, threats to resume, sudden diplomatic overtures, and abrupt reversals, like the president's decision this week to walk back a proposed 20% tariff on cargo moving through Hormuz, replacing it instead with promises of Gulf state investment into the American economy. But behind the bravado sits a genuinely difficult strategic puzzle, one that has confounded American presidents of both parties for decades. Iran's nuclear program is not simply a bargaining chip. It is, depending on who you ask, either the last insurance policy of a regime that watched what happened to nations without nuclear weapons, or a genuine existential threat to Israel and to regional stability that cannot be allowed to mature. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has argued for years, including directly to Trump, that only a decisive military campaign could permanently remove that threat. Iran's government insists its program has always been peaceful, even as international inspectors have repeatedly found activity inconsistent with that claim. Both positions cannot be fully true, and untangling the reality from the propaganda on both sides has become nearly impossible in the middle of an active war, when information itself becomes a weapon. It is also worth being honest about the criticism this war has generated, because a fair accounting of any conflict includes the voices who oppose it. Civil rights organizations, including the Council on American Islamic Relations, have accused the administration of manufacturing justifications for war that echo, uncomfortably, the run-up to the Iraq invasion more than 2 decades earlier, questioning whether the intelligence behind claims of Iranian weapons development was as solid as the White House presented it. Regional governments, including Qatar, have warned publicly that continued escalation risks consequences far beyond Iran's borders, threatening the fragile economies and security of the entire Gulf. And when Trump warned this week that the United States might strike Iranian power plants and desalination facilities, the very systems that keep drinking water flowing to millions of civilians, legal experts noted that deliberately targeting such infrastructure could cross into the territory of war crimes under international law. The president's own response to that criticism has been blunt, insisting he does not want to take that step, but that he will, if forced to. Now widen the lens, because this war is not happening in isolation. It is happening inside a presidency simultaneously juggling a dozen other fires, and each one bends and shapes the others in ways viewers rarely get to see connected. In Washington, Senate Democrats this week blocked a $1 trillion defense spending bill in direct protest over the administration's handling of the Iran war, a sign that the political consensus supporting military action, so solid in the war's opening days, is now fracturing along familiar partisan lines. At the same time, lawmakers are quietly debating whether to fold new sanctions on Iran and Hezbollah into an existing bill. Designed to pressure Russia over its war in Ukraine, a move Trump himself has floated in honor of the late Senator Lindsey Graham, one of the architects of that legislation. It is a reminder that, in modern Washington, no single conflict exists on its own island. Iran, Russia, Ukraine, and the broader architecture of American foreign policy are increasingly being fused into a single, sprawling legislative battlefield. Then there is the economy, the force that ultimately shapes how long any war can politically survive. Oil markets have been whiplashed for months by the fighting, with shipping companies rerouting away from both the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea, driving up costs that ripple outward into gas prices, inflation readings, and Federal Reserve calculations about when or whether to cut interest rates. Remarkably, American stocks actually rose this week on news that inflation was cooling, even as the war intensified, a sign of just how resilient, or perhaps how numb, markets have become to Middle East conflict after nearly 5 months of it. Halfway around the world, higher energy prices tied to the war have had the strange side effect of helping pull China out of one of its longest stretches of deflation, even as Beijing carefully calculates how much further instability it can absorb without real damage to its own slowing economy. Every barrel of oil that gets rerouted, every tanker that changes course to avoid a war zone, becomes a data point in economic reports from Washington to Beijing, 3,000 miles from the border. This is what modern war looks like, not contained to a battlefield, but distributed instantly across global supply chains, stock tickers, and central bank meetings. And what about the people actually doing the fighting, and the people simply trying to survive it? American forces under Central Command have been conducting sustained multi-hour waves of strikes against Iranian military targets, precision munitions aimed at missile sites, drone facilities, and naval capabilities meant to degrade Iran's ability to threaten shipping. On the other side, Iran's Revolutionary Guard has claimed strikes against American logistics facilities in Kuwait, footage appearing to show drone strikes on burning warehouses circulating within hours across social media. A war now fought as much in real-time video as it is in official statements. Civilian infrastructure has not been spared. Iranian state media has reported strikes damaging a water bottling plant near the Iraqi border. Gulf nations, including Kuwait and Bahrain, have issued alerts to their own citizens, warning of incoming threats and explaining that explosions their populations might hear are simply air defense systems intercepting attacks overhead, a strange, chilling new normal for civilians living along the edges of someone else's war. Here is where the story turns, because underneath all of the strikes and threats, there remains improbably a diplomatic track, still quietly alive. Even as missiles were flying this week, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi traveled to Oman, long trusted by both Washington and Tehran as a back-channel mediator, for talks aimed at finding some framework to keep shipping moving safely through the strait. Behind the scenes, officials from both governments, including reportedly Vice President J.D. Vance, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, and Trump's own envoys, have continued exploring whether a new understanding can be salvaged from the wreckage of the one signed at Versailles just weeks ago. It is one of the strange truths of this conflict. Even at its most violent moments, the machinery of negotiation never fully stops running. Whether that is a sign of hope or simply proof of how desperately exhausted both sides have become is a matter of perspective. But trust between the two governments has arguably never been thinner. Iranian officials have publicly accused Trump of deception, insisting that talks the White House claims were happening never actually took place. Iran's state media has, at various points, denied the very existence of negotiations the American side describes as ongoing. This is not a minor communication gap. It reflects something deeper, a fundamental collapse in the basic trust required for any lasting settlement, the kind of trust that, once broken by war, takes far longer to rebuild than any ceasefire document can capture on paper. And now, staring into what comes next, the honest answer is that no one, not analysts, not intelligence officials, not likely even the leaders making these decisions in real time, can say with certainty which direction this goes. There are, broadly, three paths visible from where we stand tonight. The first is a genuine return to the negotiating table, built on the technical talks now underway in Oman, potentially producing a new, more durable framework than the one that collapsed in June, one that finally resolves the core question of Iran's nuclear ambitions in a way both sides can live with. The second is a prolonged war of attrition, strikes and counterstrikes settling into a grinding, months-long rhythm that slowly reshapes the region's economy, its alliances, and its politics, without ever producing a decisive conclusion, a war that simply becomes background noise to daily life. And the third, the path implied by Trump's own words this week about finishing the job, is a dramatic and permanent escalation, one that could include strikes on Iran's civilian infrastructure, a move that would almost certainly draw international condemnation, harden Iranian resistance rather than break it, and risk pulling in other regional and global powers who have so far managed to stay on the margins of this fight. What we do know is this. The war that reignited on July 8th has already reshaped global oil markets, strained America's relationships with its Gulf allies, reopened old wounds about the legality and morality of targeting civilian infrastructure, and forced Congress into uncomfortable votes that expose just how divided Washington remains over the wisdom of continued military action. It has tested whether maximum pressure diplomacy, the defining foreign policy instinct of this presidency, can actually produce a lasting peace, or whether it simply produces louder and louder threats with diminishing returns. And it has placed 91 million Iranian civilians, people with no vote in any of these decisions, directly in the path of whatever comes next. There is a version of this story that ends in negotiated peace, sanctions gradually eased, nuclear inspectors allowed back in, tankers moving freely again through the strait, a fragile but real stability slowly returning to a region that has known almost none of it for decades. There is another version where this becomes the defining, grinding conflict of the back half of this decade, a war that reshapes American politics heading into the next election cycle, drains resources that might otherwise flow toward the Pacific or toward Ukraine, and permanently alters how the rest of the world calculates the risk of testing American power. Which version we get may depend less on the size of America's arsenal and more on something far harder to measure: whether too exhausted, governments, each convinced the other is negotiating in bad faith, can find enough trust to finally step back from a war that has already outlived nearly everyone's early predictions about how quickly it would end. For now, the missiles remain locked and loaded. The talks in Oman continue, and the world once again waits to see which version of Donald Trump shows up next, the dealmaker, or the man who promised to finish the job.